Well, if I asked you what Christmas was about, you likely would say Jesus, or the birth of Christ, or something suitably religious or theological, and you would be right. But on a more human level, let me suggest that Christmas is about memories. We forget so much of our day-to-day lives, but Christmas produces memories that stick. We all have them. Some are good, some bad. Many just a normal play of family dynamics and traditions and customs. And those memories range from our early childhoods to our last Christmas just a year ago. I have vivid recollections as a child traveling by train from Houston to New Orleans, where my maternal and paternal grandparents had the courtesy to live across the street from each other. We would travel in a Pullman berth. I would be in the upper berth, and my parents shared the lower berth. But before we turned in for the night, we would watch the countryside pass by. House after house after house, decorated for Christmas. I remember flying from Monroe, Louisiana to New Orleans at 7 a.m. on Christmas morning on a Southern Airways DC-3. We were the only people on the plane. My dad directed the church choir, so we couldn't leave any time before that. I remember climbing the steps of my fraternity house up to John Martin's room just to hear a great new album that had come out just before Christmas break, Rubber Soul by the Beatles. John would die a second Marine lieutenant in Vietnam. Some memories are good, some are bad. I remember well hanging out and drinking with Jo, my wife now, and our friends at the Cascades, and dancing at the Saddle and Spur in Monroe, Louisiana during the Christmas holidays. Am I dating myself? Pullmans and DC-3s in Vietnam and legal drinking at 18. Of course, there was a Christmas I had to borrow Joe's brother's draft card to at least create the appearance of drinking legally. But I digress. Then more recently in our adult lives, we'll never forget the Christmas Eve when our two older boys were T-boned by a van en route to pick up my aunt from church. Jim, can Mom hear us? Good. Don't tell her we hit our heads. But they were fine, save for a temporary case of amnesia that produced a scene worthy of any TV sitcom. Or there was the Christmas when we warned our 5 children that if we did not have a majority of them home for Christmas, we would take whoever showed up and go to Bermuda. Only 2 came for Christmas, 1 short of a majority, and we went to Bermuda. And at the midnight service at Christmas Eve, there in Bermuda, we marveled that nearly every young woman in church knew our boys' names after they had enjoyed only one night out on the town. Memories. We all have them. In the latter half of the 1st century, the early followers of Christ had come to an understanding of who Jesus was. He was the Christ, the Messiah. He was divine. Jesus needed to be remembered. And all the stories and memories of Jesus' time on earth that had been recited when they had gathered for prayer and worship were reduced to writing in the Gospels according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, Luke likely was the most eloquent and educated of the writers among the 4 evangelists. Luke knew the details of Jesus' birth would matter. And he knew that the story of the birth of Christ had to be memorable. So unlike the other 3 versions of the Gospel, Luke provides the so-called infancy narrative, describing Mary's encounter with the angel, her visit to Elizabeth, and the journey to Bethlehem with Joseph, where Jesus was born in a manger, and angels announced his birth to shepherds watching their flocks by night. Luke created a story we can hear countless times and still want to hear it again and again and again and never forget. Now we can appreciate Luke's Christmas story from several perspectives. Most of us were brought up to take it at face value as an accurate portrayal of Jesus' birth. Now we quibble about whether Jesus was born in a manger or in a cave or in a manger in a cave, but we had no doubt that the angels had announced Christ's birth to the shepherds. And that's about the only way people heard it for about the first 1900 years. And there was nothing wrong with that. Legend had it that Luke was close to Mary and that she recounted the story of that holy night to him. Luke just reported what he had been told. And his story, therefore, must be an accurate reflection of the facts and circumstances of Jesus' birth. But in the late 19th century, as the age of reason increased its hold, accepting the stories of the Bible as factually correct began to fall out of fashion in some supposedly more enlightened quarters. And as the modern culture became dominant in the 20th century, and the Bible was subject to more critical study, a different appreciation of the Nativity story emerged. It was then seen as a carefully crafted story to express what Luke saw as essential to understand who Jesus was. For example, being born of a virgin was characteristic of God's. So to express that Jesus was indeed divine, Luke portrayed Jesus as born of a virgin. Luke also saw Jesus as having a preference for the poor, the marginal, and the outcasts of society. So who were the first people informed of Jesus' birth? Shepherds, the lowliest of the low in first century society. Luke also knew Jesus would oppose the rich and powerful, that Jesus' kingdom was not of this world. So in Luke's account, Jesus is not born the royal child of a powerful and prestigious parents in some lavish castle, but in a manger, surrounded by humble, everyday parents and farm animals. Again, not an unreasonable interpretation, and one that reminds us that the Bible never was intended as a history book, but as a theological rendition of historical events. And now we find ourselves in a postmodern culture that takes the Christmas story from Luke that we all know and love and says, it's such a beautiful story, it must be true. Factually accurate, maybe not, but so beautiful, it must be true. The infancy narrative in the Gospel according to Luke does reflect the wonder and the truth of Christmas. We do not need to shoehorn Luke's account into the confines of known history to know that Luke knew something unique in history, something glorious had happened. He told the story of Christ's birth in a way that underscored the significance of that birth of the tiny child in Bethlehem, a child who was fully human and fully divine, a child who would be God walking among us, humble, compassionate, just, and loving. A child who never would be an earthly king or incite a revolution as some had hoped, but instead would launch a movement that continues to this day and boasts a global membership of nearly 2.2 billion followers of Christ. In this child born in a manger, God was going the last full measure to show the world what it was like to be made in the image of God. Jesus, the fully human and the fully divine, would come into the world, and humanity, made in the image of God, would be called to be imitators of Christ. And that is what we celebrate at Christmas. The birth of a child and the entry of God into the world as one of us. A brother, a mentor, a teacher, the perfect example of divine will lived day to day and moment to moment. And the great story of the salvation of the world, that pivotal chapter, was written. Luke told the story in a way that we can never forget. and a story that we could tell and retell year after year and generation to generation. Luke gave us memories. And the truth of those memories is what has called us here tonight, gathered to remember, to be amazed again at what the angels told shepherds, to worship, to celebrate. That to you is born this day in the city of David, a Savior who is the Messiah, the Lord.